I shaped these oak beams with a lifetime of self-reliance. Now, after one fall, the grandson I raised has turned my home into a prison. He's about to learn that these carpenters' hands may have grown old, but they've never forgotten how to take back what is mine. Have you ever looked at the house you built with your own two hands and felt like a prisoner in it? I have. Hello, my friends. Wherever you're listening from, whether you're in your wood shop with the scent of sawdust in the air or sitting back in that familiar lazy boy recliner, thank you for tuning in. Go ahead and hit that like button and let me know in the comments what city you're listening from. My name is Thomas, and this is my story. I still remember the feeling of that last job, the smell of pine wood after a morning rain, the heat from the tin roof radiating up into my face. It was a familiar, comforting warmth. I'd mended hundreds of roofs just like it over 50 years. My hands knew the work better than they knew my own face in the mirror. But that day, all it took was a single moment of inattention, a slight shift of weight onto a plank that wasn't quite set. The wood slid out from under me. For a second, the whole wide Texas sky just tumbled, a swirl of blue and white. I didn't scream. An old carpenter doesn't scream when he falls. He spent a lifetime working with gravity, respecting it. When it finally claims a piece of him, he just listens. I listened to the sound of my own hip bone shattering. It wasn't loud. It was a dense, definitive crack, like a sturdy old branch finally giving way in a storm. That was the sound that ended a man's independence. It was the sound of my life's foundation breaking apart. Jack, my grandson, came to the hospital. He looked pale, his eyes wide and uncertain. He took my hand, and I could feel a tremor in his grip. "Don't you worry, Grandpa," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm going to take care of you." And I believed him. Lord, how I wanted to believe him. I looked at my only grandson, the last link to my daughter, and in his face I saw a ghost of her, and even a ghost of my late wife, Mary. In that sterile, white room, hooked up to machines that beeped away the seconds of my new, dependent life, I thought, at least I'm not alone. But I've learned something since then. Loneliness isn't always the worst thing. Sometimes the worst thing is to be made invisible by the very person you thought would see you. To have your own family look right through you. That's a kind of hell that solitude can't touch. The first day back home was the beginning of it. Jack was pushing my wheelchair from the car. I could feel his impatience in the jerky movements, the way he rushed over the uneven flagstones I'd laid myself years ago. "Come on, Grandpa, almost there," he muttered, more to himself than to me. Then came a jarring shock that ran right up my spine. He'd misjudged the doorway. The wheelchair slammed hard into the solid oak frame. My shoulder crashed into the wood, the very same timber I'd chosen, planed, and sanded until it was smooth as glass. A sharp electric pain shot through me. Jack just grunted out a quick, "My bad," and hurried into the kitchen, the sound of his worn-out sneakers scuffing against the floor. I sat there throbbing, staring at the small new dent in the wood. It wasn't an accident. Not really. It was a statement. I was no longer the master of this house. I was just an obstacle in it. The doctor had prescribed a bottle of strong painkillers. The good stuff. "Only when you can't stand it, Thomas," he'd warned, looking at me over his spectacles. In the first few days, the pain was a constant, gnawing thing, so I took them as needed. But after a week, I noticed the pills in the orange bottle were disappearing faster than they should have been. I'd count them in the morning, and by evening, the count would be off. I told myself it was my own mind playing tricks on me, that the pain was making me take more than I realized. An old man's memory can't be trusted, can it? That's what I tried to believe. I clung to that lie with a desperate strength, because if it wasn't my faulty memory, if I wasn't the one miscounting, then the truth was something far too terrifying to face. My disability check was deposited directly into my account. I had Jack withdraw a little cash for me, just to keep in my wallet for small things, a habit from a lifetime of paying my own way. One evening, I opened the worn leather billfold and saw that a $20 bill was missing. I waited until he was in a decent mood and I asked him, keeping my voice as gentle as I could. "Jack," I said, Did you happen to borrow some money from my wallet?" He didn't answer. He just turned from the TV and looked at me. There was a coldness in his eyes I'd never seen before. Then he walked over, leaned down, and gripped my upper arm. His fingers dug in, hard. "Don't you ever accuse me of that," he hissed. "An old man's skin is thin, like parchment paper." The next morning, a dark bruise bloomed there, a nasty, purple-black stain like a thundercloud. That's when I started wearing long-sleeved shirts, even in the blistering Texas heat. The shame of it burned hotter than any summer sun. Frank, my old buddy from the VFW post, said he'd stop by. I was sitting in the living room when I heard the familiar rumble of his Ford pickup pulling into the driveway. Then, the solid, friendly sound of his knuckles on the front door. A little flicker of hope ignited in my chest. A real conversation. A connection to the world I used to know. But then I heard Jack's voice from the hallway, loud and clear. "He's sleeping right now," he called out. "He's really tired." I wasn't sleeping. I was sitting right there, in my chair, wide awake and suffocating in the silence of my own home. I heard Frank say something like, "Oh, okay. Well, tell him I said hi." I heard his footsteps on the porch, the truck door closing, the engine turning over. I listened as the sound of my friend's truck faded down the street until there was nothing left but the hum of the refrigerator. Jack had just cut my last thread to the outside world. He had locked the final door, not with a key, but with a lie. And in that profound, crushing silence, he left me completely and utterly alone. Mornings used to be my favorite part of the day. I'd ease myself onto the porch swing with a hot cup of black coffee, the steam fogging up my glasses, and just watch the sun climb over the tops of the old oak trees. It was quiet, but it was a living quiet, filled with the sound of cardinals arguing in the branches and the low hum of the world waking up. Now morning is just a continuation of the night, a long, drawn-out emptiness. After Frank's truck disappeared down the road, a new kind of silence fell over the house. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, an active, listening silence. I'd sit in my wheelchair in the middle of the living room, the one I'd built for Mary and me, and just listen to the nothingness. The birds still sang outside, I suppose, but I couldn't hear them anymore. The silence in the house was too loud. My old radio, the one that sat on the kitchen counter for 30 years, was gone. It had played the morning news every day of my adult life. Jack had put it away in a closet. "That thing gives me a headache, Grandpa," he'd said. But the silence he created in its place was a far worse affliction. It was a headache in the soul. It was the sound of being erased. He started to forget my meals. That's what he'd call it. Or he'd come into the living room, not looking at me, and toss a peanut butter sandwich onto the end table. No plate, no glass of milk, not a single word. Then he'd be gone, back to his room, the door closing with a soft click. I'd sit there staring at the sad, pale square of bread. I remembered the meals Mary used to cook, the smell of her roasted chicken filling every corner of the house, the warmth of the steam rising from a bowl of stew. She put love into her food. You could taste it. This sandwich tasted of nothing. It was just fuel, a loveless transaction to keep a machine running. Some days, the gnawing hunger in my stomach was a dull ache compared to the sharp, stabbing pain in my hip. But this wasn't about feeding me. This was a message, delivered on cheap white bread. You are worthless. You are a chore. One afternoon, the quiet was shattered. The door to his room flew open and Jack stormed into the living room. His eyes were bloodshot and a fine tremor ran through his hands. He was clutching a checkbook and a pen, and he threw them into my lap. The plastic spine of the checkbook hit my leg with a sharp rap. "Sign it," he snarled. It wasn't a request. I picked up the checkbook. He had already filled one out. The payee line was blank, but the amount was clear. $500. My hand felt unsteady as I held it. "What's this for, son?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even, trying to be the calm grandfather he used to know. "You don't need to know. Just sign the damn thing." His voice cracked on the last word, climbing into a high, desperate register. This wasn't the boy I taught how to bait a hook down at the creek. This wasn't my grandson. This was a cornered animal, all teeth and desperation. Something inside me, something that had been dormant for a long time, stirred. I looked down at the check, at the number written in his shaky hand. I thought of Mary, how we'd saved every spare dollar, how we'd planned for a peaceful old age. I thought of the sweat and sawdust that had earned that money. I placed the pen deliberately on the table beside me. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it felt like the loudest sound I had made in months. "I'm not signing it." I don't know where the strength came from. Maybe from the memory of my wife's careful budgeting. Maybe from the simple, stubborn pride of a man who had provided for his family his entire life. For one long second, there was only the sound of his ragged breathing. Then a blur of motion. The sound of the slap was a dry, sharp crack that echoed in the silent room. My head snapped to the side. A stinging, white-hot fire erupted across my cheek. It wasn't a powerful blow. He was weak, unsteady, but it shattered everything. It shattered the last fragile image I held of the little boy who used to hold my hand. In its place stood a stranger with cold eyes and a desperate soul. He stared at his own hand as if he didn't recognize it, then turned without a word and fled back into his room, slamming the door behind him. That night, it took me a long time to maneuver myself into the bathroom. I gripped the sides of the sink, my knuckles white, and forced myself to look in the mirror. One side of my face was swollen and red, a faint handprint beginning to darken on the wrinkled skin. But it wasn't the physical mark I saw. I saw the eyes of a defeated man, a man who couldn't protect himself in his own home. I had spent my entire life building things: houses, furniture, a family, a reputation for being a strong, capable man. Now, all I saw in that mirror was a frail old man with a slap mark on his face and failure in his eyes. I wheeled myself back into the living room and stopped by the large picture window. Outside, the moonlight cast long shadows across the yard, falling on the dark, silent shape of my old woodshop. My tools were in there, hanging patiently on the walls. My saws, my hammers, my levels. Everything a man needs to build, to fix, to create order from chaos. I thought about calling 911. What would I say? My grandson, the boy I raised, slapped me because I wouldn't give him money? The shame of it felt like a physical weight on my chest, pressing the air from my lungs. No. A Carter man doesn't call strangers to fix his own family's problems. But as I sat there, staring at the silhouette of my workshop, I knew I couldn't let this go on. The despair began to recede, and in its place, something else began to glow. It was anger. Not a hot shouting anger, but a cold, quiet anger. A slow-burning ember hidden deep beneath the ashes of my humiliation. And in the dark, silent house, that ember began to glow brighter. In the days that followed the slap, a strange and unsettling calm fell over the house. Jack's behavior changed so suddenly it gave me whiplash. The angry, desperate animal was gone, and in its place was a version of the grandson I thought I'd lost. He started cooking hot meals, simple things like soup and grilled cheese, but they were warm. He'd bring me a plate, even ask if I wanted to watch the Cowboys game. He apologized. One evening, he sat on the ottoman in front of my chair, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," he mumbled. "I've been under a lot of stress. I never should have done that. You know I love you, right?" A part of me, a foolish, grandfatherly part, wanted to reach out and put my hand on his shoulder. It wanted to believe him, to accept the apology and erase the sting on my cheek from my memory. But the other part of me, the part that had been awakened by that cold, quiet anger, was wary. His soft words felt like a fresh coat of paint slapped hastily over a rotten wall. It might look better for a moment, but you know the decay is still spreading underneath. I just nodded. I didn't have the words to explain the chasm that had opened between us. A few days later, he came to me with a sheaf of papers and that same gentle, caring tone. "Hey, Grandpa," he said, pulling a pen from his pocket. "Just some insurance forms from the hospital. They need your signature to process the billing for your stay. I already filled everything out for you. You just have to sign at the bottom." He pointed to a small line marked with an X. I looked at the stack. It was thick, full of dense paragraphs of tiny print that swam before my eyes. My hip was aching, a deep, throbbing pain that made it hard to concentrate on anything else. I was just so tired. Tired of the pain, tired of the tension, tired of fighting a battle I didn't even understand. I took the pen. I saw my name, and I signed it. In that moment of exhaustion, I signed away the last piece of my financial independence. I didn't know it was a power of attorney. I just knew I wanted the conversation to be over so I could be alone with my pain. About a week went by. The house phone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the quiet afternoon. It was on a table near my chair, and I instinctively reached for it. But before my fingers could touch the receiver, Jack darted out from the kitchen and snatched it up. "Hello?" he said, his back to me. "Yes, this is his grandson. Oh, he's resting right now. Is there a problem?" I watched the muscles in his shoulders tense up. He listened for a moment, his voice dropping lower. "Okay, yeah, I'll handle it. Thanks." He hung up abruptly. His face was pale when he turned around. "Who was that, son?" I asked. "Oh, just a telemarketer, selling something," he replied. The lie came out too fast, too smooth, but not before my eyes had caught the caller ID on the phone's little screen. It was the number for our local bank branch, the one Mary and I had used for 40 years. An old man's intuition is a strange thing. It's not loud or logical. It's a quiet, persistent whisper that you learn not to ignore. That evening, I waited until I heard Jack's car pull out of the driveway. Then, with my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs, I wheeled myself into the kitchen. The plastic trash can was nearly full. I leaned over, the effort sending a fresh wave of pain through my hip, and started digging through the day's garbage, coffee grounds, empty milk cartons, junk mail, and then I found it, a crumpled ball of paper at the bottom. It was a bank transaction receipt. My hands trembled as I smoothed it out on the kitchen table. It was a withdrawal slip from my savings account, the account that Mary and I had fed, dollar by dollar, for our entire marriage, for our future. The amount made the air rush out of my lungs. A large sum, far more than I'd ever taken out at once. At the bottom of the slip was the signature line. It had my name, Thomas Carter, scrawled on it. But it wasn't my handwriting. It was a crude, shaky imitation. The world seemed to tilt and go gray. This was more than theft. This was a desecration. A cold panic seized me. I spun the wheelchair around and began a frantic tour of the house. I went to the old cedar chest in my bedroom, where I kept the few things that truly mattered. I lifted the heavy lid. The velvet box that held my father's military medals from his time in Korea was there. I opened it. Empty. The cool, heavy weight of the medals was gone. I wheeled myself to the bookshelf in the den, reaching behind a row of old Western paperbacks for my coin collection, something I'd started as a boy. The leather-bound albums were gone. He wasn't just taking my money, he was taking my life. He was selling off pieces of my past, my father's honor, my childhood joys, melting them down to feed whatever hungry ghost was haunting him. This house, the one I'd built to be a sanctuary, was no longer my home. It had become a gold mine, and I was the vein of ore he was stripping, piece by painful piece. I've worked my whole life. I never spent foolishly, always put something away for a rainy day, for my old age. Listening to this, have you ever felt that fear? That everything you've worked so hard to build could be taken away, not by a stranger, but by the very person you're supposed to trust the most? Let me know what you think in the comments below. My wife, Sarah, loved wind chimes. She used to say that their sound on the breeze was the angels whispering to each other. After she passed, the house felt so empty, so profoundly quiet that I couldn't stand it. I gathered up her collection of delicate porcelain chimes, the ones she'd found at little craft fairs and antique shops, and I hung them in the big picture window in the living room. Each one was a different shape, painted with tiny, intricate flowers. When the Texas wind would stir, they would create a clear, high, gentle music that filled the house. It was the only thing that made me feel like she was still here with me, in the quiet moments. They were my last, most fragile connection to the life we had built together. One evening, Jack came home in the worst state I'd ever seen him. His eyes were wild, his hair was matted with sweat, and he carried a frantic, hunted energy that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. He started yelling, not at me, but at the walls, at the ceiling, ranting about money, about people who were after him. He began tearing through the house, pulling cushions off the sofa, yanking books from the shelves, his movements jerky and violent. I yelled at him to stop, to calm down, but my voice was a feeble thing, a dry rustle of leaves against a hurricane. He didn't even hear me. He was a storm, destroying everything in his path, and I was just a man in a wheelchair, a helpless spectator watching my world being torn apart. And then it happened. In his blind rage, he spun toward the window. His arm swung out, a wide, careless arc of fury, and he swiped the entire collection of Sarah's chimes from the windowsill. There was a sickening, discordant crash, a sound of a dozen delicate things breaking all at once. It was a sound that ripped through the very fabric of the house. It was followed by a silence so sudden and so absolute, it was like the world had ended. The whispering of the angels had been violently silenced. On the polished oak floor lay a glittering sea of shattered porcelain. Jack froze. For a single, horrifying moment, the madness seemed to drain from his face, replaced by a flicker of what looked like shock, maybe even regret. He stared at the destruction at his feet, then looked at me. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Then he turned, stumbled back to his room, and slammed the door, leaving me alone with the wreckage. I didn't cry. The well had run dry long ago. For a long time I just sat there, looking at the pieces of my wife's memory scattered on the floor. Then, slowly, deliberately, I began to move. Ignoring the screaming protest from my hip, I leaned forward, bracing myself against the arm of the wheelchair, and lowered myself to the floor. The pain was immense, a white-hot agony that threatened to make me pass out. But I didn't care. I got onto my hands and knees, and I began to crawl. I picked up the first shard of porcelain. Its edge was sharp, and it bit into the soft skin of my fingertip, drawing a small bead of blood. I barely felt it. The physical pain was a distant echo of the gaping wound in my soul. I gathered the pieces, one by one. A fragment of a painted bluebell, a sliver of a delicate, wing-shaped piece. Each one I picked up was a fresh stab of grief. He hadn't just broken a set of wind chimes. He had taken a hammer to the last beautiful thing I had left. He had shattered my heart. I was still on the floor when the first gray light of dawn filtered through the window. I sat there, surrounded by the debris of my past, my hands raw, my hip a universe of pain. And in that quiet, broken moment, something inside me shifted. The despair that had been my constant companion finally burned out, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. The shame that had forced me into long-sleeved shirts and silence evaporated, and in its place, the ember of anger I had felt before roared into a silent, contained flame. I will not be silent anymore, I told myself. I will not be a victim. He has taken my money. He has taken my health. He has taken my dignity. And he has smashed my memories. But he will not take this house. He will not erase Sarah's legacy. This ends now. With a grunt of effort that took everything I had, I pushed myself up and back into my chair. I didn't clean up the broken porcelain. I left it there on the floor, a stark, glittering reminder of the line that had been crossed. I wheeled myself into my bedroom, to the old cedar wardrobe that smelled of my entire life. I reached deep into the back, under a pile of old wool sweaters, and my fingers found what they were looking for, a small, dovetailed wooden box. I placed it on my lap and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were a few small, specialized carpenter's tools I had always kept separate from the rest. A miniature flathead screwdriver, perfect for tightening the tiny screws on eyeglasses. A spool of fine-gauge steel wire, strong and flexible. a well-worn carving knife with a blade still sharp enough to shave with. My hands, which had trembled with weakness and grief just hours before, were now perfectly steady. I picked them up, feeling their familiar, solid weight. These were no longer tools for building. These were tools for survival. The fire that caught in the ruin of my heart didn't burn hot and fast. It was a slow, methodical heat, and with it, the grief and the shame were burned away, leaving only the hard, clear lines of a problem to be solved. I began to watch Jack, not as a grandfather watches his grandson, but as a carpenter studies a piece of rotten wood. You don't get angry at the rot. You measure its depth, you find its source, and you plan how you're going to cut it out. My world, once shrunk to the confines of a wheelchair, became a field of observation. I learned his rhythms. He'd sleep late, emerging from his room around noon with the sour smell of stale sweat clinging to him. He'd leave the house in frantic bursts, usually in the late afternoon, and return hours later, either sullen and quiet or wired and agitated. I watched him pace in the backyard, taking hushed, angry phone calls, his free hand constantly gnawing at his fingernails. That was the tell. The gnawing. It was the sign of the hunger, the gnawing inside him that was eating my life to feed itself. I no longer saw the boy I loved. I saw a series of patterns, a collection of weaknesses. I saw a problem that needed a solution, and this house, my house, would be the workshop where I would build it. My first move had to be made with care. I waited. Patience is a tool a man learns after 60 years of living. One morning, I heard the shower running. The sound of rushing water was my cover. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage, as I wheeled myself silently across the living room and into the hallway. His bedroom door was ajar. The room was a disaster, clothes strewn everywhere, and it reeked of something acrid and unwashed. I didn't have much time. I focused on the pair of dirty jeans discarded on the floor. With a surge of adrenaline, I leaned precariously from my chair, my hips screaming in protest, and my fingers closed around the rough denim. I pulled them onto my lap and began to search the pockets. My fingers found it, folded into a small, tight square. A pawn ticket, from a shop on the far side of town I'd never even heard of. I unfolded it with trembling hands. The item description was printed in cheap, faded ink, vintage coin collection, and next to it, the amount, $50. The air left my body in a ragged gasp. $50. My father's father had started that collection. It had Morgan silver dollars, buffalo nickels, coins that had passed through the hands of generations of American men. He had sold a century of history for $50 for a fix. I carefully folded the ticket and tucked it deep into my own pocket. This was my first piece of evidence, the first plank in the case I was building. The next opportunity came a few nights later. Jack came home smelling of cheap whiskey, stumbled to the sofa, and passed out. As he slumped over, his smartphone slipped from his limp hand and fell to the floor. I waited, listening to the rhythm of his snoring for a full 10 minutes before I moved. I wheeled over and used my long-handled grabber, the one I used for things I dropped, to gently pinch the phone and lift it onto my lap. My hands shook as I pressed the power button. The lock screen lit up. He was foolish enough to use his own birthday as the passcode. I swiped it open and went straight to his text messages. The screen was filled with a long thread from a contact named Rico. The messages were brutal and direct. "Where's my money? You have 24 hours. Don't make me come to the old man's house. I'm done waiting." My blood ran cold. I understood now. This wasn't just an addiction. Jack was being hunted. He was a drowning man, and in his panic, he was pulling me under with him. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that I couldn't do this alone. I was a prisoner in my own home. I needed a voice on the outside. And then I remembered the phone call. The bank. I remembered the teller's name on the caller ID. Maria Sanchez. She'd been at that branch since she was a teenager. She knew me and Sarah by name. Always asked about the garden. She had given Sarah a small bouquet of flowers from her own yard the last time we were there together. I found an old phone book in the den and looked up the bank's number. Hope, for the first time in months, began to flicker. It was a tiny, fragile flame, but it was there. Now I just needed a plan, a way to make the call without the warden hearing me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, looking out at my workshop. It had always been my sanctuary, a place of creation. Now, I saw it differently. It was my arsenal. I wasn't thinking of guns or knives in the traditional sense. A carpenter knows that anything can be a weapon if you know how to use it. I thought of the large, industrial-strength rat traps I kept in the back. I thought of the spools of baling wire, of the heavy-duty staple gun and the long, sharp nails it fired. A man who builds things knows how to unbuild them too. The fear that had lived in my gut for so long was finally hardening, sharpening into something cold and useful. I would defend this house. I would defend Sarah's memory, by any means necessary. Before the sun came up, I wheeled myself to my desk and took out an old, leather-bound journal and a carpenter's pencil. In the dim light, I began to write. I wrote down the date Jack pushed me, the date I found the bruise on my arm, the details of the pawn ticket, the name Rico from the phone, the amount of the withdrawal. I wrote down everything, my handwriting the shaky scrawl of an old man, but the words were hard as nails. This wasn't a diary. It was an indictment. Page by page, word by word, I was laying the foundation for my own justice. I knew I would only get one shot. My plan depended on a small, predictable window of opportunity. Jack had a habit, a ritual. Sometime after midnight, the gnawing would get too strong for him, and he'd slip out of the house. He was usually gone for no more than 30 minutes. It was my only chance to use the landline without him knowing. So I waited. I sat in the living room, my wheelchair as still and silent as a stone monument in the dark. Every sound in the house became magnified. The low, electric hum of the refrigerator, the groan of the old house's timbers settling, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall felt like a countdown to a detonation. My own breathing sounded impossibly loud in my ears. I kept my journal clutched in my lap, the pages filled with my indictment, feeling its weight as a source of courage. Then finally, I heard the sound I'd been waiting for, the soft click of the front door opening, and the quieter click as it closed behind him. My heart began to pound against my ribs like a trapped bird. The race was on. I wheeled myself as quickly and quietly as I could to the end table where the phone sat. My hands, clumsy with adrenaline, fumbled with the receiver. I punched in the bank's number, which I had memorized from the old phone book. I prayed that their after-hours system would have an option to leave a message, to connect me to an operator. Anything. Nothing. Just a smooth, recorded female voice, politely informing me of the bank's business hours. Our offices are currently closed. Please call back between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., Monday through Friday. A dead end. I glanced at the clock. 10 precious minutes had already evaporated. I needed a human being. I needed Maria. My mind raced. The phone book. Not for the bank, but for her. It was a desperate, crazy idea. I wheeled myself over to the bookshelf, my hands sweating. I pulled out the thick, dusty volume for our county. It felt like an artifact from another lifetime. The streetlight outside cast just enough of a weak yellow glow for me to see, but the print was tiny, and my old eyes struggled to focus. I ran my trembling finger down the columns of names, my lips moving silently. Sanchez. Sanchez. And then, there it was. Sanchez Maria. An address on the other side of town and a home phone number. Should I do this? A cold wave of shame washed over me. Calling a woman I barely knew at her private home in the middle of the night? A man doesn't do that. A man handles his own problems. The hesitation lasted only a second. The image of the shattered wind chimes flashed in my mind, the memory of the sting on my cheek. The fear of what Jack would do next was a far greater beast than the shame of this phone call. I wheeled back to the phone. My finger hovered over the keypad. I took a deep, ragged breath and punched in the numbers. The phone rang on the other end, once, twice. Each ring sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. My nerve almost broke. My hand moved to hang up. Then a click. A sleepy, groggy voice answered. "Hello?" "Maria?" I whispered, my own voice a dry, hoarse rasp. It's Thomas Carter." There was a pause. I could hear the sound of rustling sheets, of someone shifting in bed. "Mr. Carter, what's wrong? It's the middle of the night." "I know. I'm so sorry to bother you," I rushed, the words tumbling out in a hushed torrent. "I can't talk for long. I just had a question. About that withdrawal from my account last week. The big one. Did it seem unusual to you?" Another pause. This one longer, heavier. I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, the sleepiness in her voice being replaced by alarm. I heard her sit up. "Mr. Carter, are you okay? It seemed very strange. I tried to call you that afternoon to confirm, but your grandson said you were resting and couldn't be disturbed." "I wasn't resting," I said, my voice cracking despite my efforts to keep it steady. The confirmation sent a jolt of both terror and validation through me. "Maria, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Please, watch my account. Don't allow any more withdrawals, any transactions at all, unless I am there in person. Can you do that for me? Can you put a note on it?" I'll do my best, Mr. Carter. I can set an alert. But are you sure you're all right? Do you need me to call someone?" The sound of a car engine turning onto our street sent a spear of ice through my heart. He was coming back. "I'm fine. Thank you, Maria." "Thank you." I slammed the phone down into its cradle, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I had done it. I had opened a door. I had found a voice. But as I sat there in the dark, listening to the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, I wasn't sure if I had just started a war I had no chance of winning. Sometimes, to ask for help, you have to do things you never thought you would, like calling a near stranger in the dead of night. Have you ever had to put your faith in an unexpected person to get through a difficult time? I'd be interested to hear your story. My call to Maria did not go unnoticed. There was a change in the air the next morning, a thick, watchful silence that was different from the neglectful quiet I had grown used to. Jack didn't speak to me, but I could feel his eyes on me, filled with a new kind of suspicious, resentful energy. He must have tried to use my card, or perhaps the bank had called again and he'd intercepted it. I didn't know the specifics, but I knew my small act of defiance had thrown a wrench into his machine. The consequences came when he left for the day. I heard his footsteps pause outside my bedroom door, followed by the distinct metallic sound of a key turning in the lock. A sharp, final click. I was no longer just isolated. I was a prisoner. A cold spike of panic tried to rise in my chest, the primal fear of being trapped. But the cold, hard anger that had become my new foundation quickly extinguished it. I wheeled myself over to the door and tested the knob. It was solid. He had locked me in. I sat there for a moment, listening to the silence of the house, and a slow, grim smile touched my lips. "You made a big mistake, boy," I thought. "You locked a carpenter in a room with his tools." I looked around the space that had been my sanctuary for 40 years, the room I had shared with Sarah. Now it was my cell. But every prison has a flaw, if you know where to look. My eyes fell on the hinges of the door. They were old, solid brass, but the screws were slotted, not Phillips head, and I could see the faint beginnings of rust in the grooves. With the small, flathead screwdriver from my wooden box, I could have that door off its hinges in less than 5 minutes. But escape wasn't the goal. Not yet. A bigger plan was forming, a plan that required one final, undeniable piece of evidence. I needed to bring the crime to me. I knew Jack's hunger. It was a bottomless pit. He had taken the coins. He had taken my cash. He was selling off pieces of my life one by one. I had to assume he had searched my room before, but he was careless, blinded by his addiction. There was one last thing of value he hadn't found. My father's gold watch. It was a beautiful, heavy timepiece he'd received upon his retirement from the railroad, and it was my most treasured possession after Sarah's things. It lived in a velvet-lined box in the nightstand drawer right next to my bed. That was the bait. I wheeled over to the nightstand. I opened the drawer and positioned the velvet box just so. Then I closed it, leaving it open just a crack, a sliver of an invitation. Just enough that a person glancing in might see the corner of the dark blue velvet, a hint of something valuable hidden within. It was a gamble, a bet on his greed overpowering his caution. Next, the trap. Years ago, I'd had a problem with raccoons getting into the workshop. I'd bought a professional-grade steel rat trap, the kind with a spring so powerful it could break a man's finger. I had kept it, oiled and ready, in the back of my closet. I retrieved it, the cold, heavy steel feeling potent in my hands. That night, after the house fell silent, I went to work. The process was delicate. I set the trap, the powerful spring groaning in protest as I pulled the kill bar back and locked it in place. The tension in the mechanism was immense. The slightest touch would release it. I carefully placed the set trap deep inside the nightstand drawer, behind the watch box. Then I took the fine-gauge steel wire from my kit. I looped one end securely around the trigger mechanism of the trap. I threaded the other end through a tiny hole I had drilled in the back of the drawer years ago for a cable. On the outside, I tied the other end of the wire firmly to the hinge of the velvet box itself. The setup was simple and brutal. Anyone pulling the box forward would inevitably pull the wire. The wire would pull the trigger, and the jaws of the trap would snap shut on whatever was in their path. I put my tools away and got into bed, leaving the drawer just as I'd planned. I didn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, my ears straining, my body rigid with anticipation. Hours passed. Then I heard it, the soft, furtive sound of a key in my door. The whisper of the door swinging open. I controlled my breathing, making it deep and even, feigning sleep. I heard his cautious footsteps approach the bed. A pause. Then, the slow wooden creak of the nightstand drawer being pulled open. There was a sharp metallic snap that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. It was followed instantly by a high-pitched scream of agony and a string of vicious curses. I opened my eyes. Jack was hopping on one foot, clutching his hand to his chest, his face a mask of white-hot pain and disbelief. The steel jaws of the trap had slammed down hard on his fingers. The velvet box had been thrown from the drawer by the force of the trap, and it lay open on the floor. And there, nestled next to my father's gleaming gold watch, was a small, clear plastic baggie, filled with white powder. He stared at me, his eyes wild with a mixture of hatred and shock. "You crazy old bastard," he hissed, cradling his bleeding, mangled hand. I said nothing. I didn't have to. I just looked at him. I looked at his injured hand. After the incident with the trap, the atmosphere in the house shifted from one of neglectful tyranny to a cold, silent war. Jack avoided me. He never mentioned his injured hand, which he kept wrapped in a dirty bandage, but I could feel the venom in his eyes whenever he looked my way. He started locking me in my room for most of the day, sliding a plate of food inside only when he felt like it. The house was submerged in a thick, suffocating quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, heavy with unspoken threats. But I was no longer afraid. The fear had been replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I had my proof, locked away in the small wooden box with my tools. I had an ally on the outside, a single crack in the wall of my prison. All I had to do was wait for the signal. It came 2 days later. Around noon, I heard the familiar rumble of a heavy-duty pickup truck pulling into the driveway. Frank's Ford. This time there was no polite knock on the door. A long, sustained blast from the truck's horn shattered the silence, a sound as aggressive and unignorable as an air raid siren. I saw Jack dart to the living room window, his face pale with panic. He scrambled to my locked door. "Tell him to go away," he hissed through the wood, his voice tight with fear. I remained silent in my chair. Frank laid on the horn again, this time with a pattern. 3 short blasts, then 1 long one. It was an old signal from our VFW post, a code we used on maneuvers. It meant, "I know you're in there. I know something's wrong. I'm not leaving." Jack was trapped. He couldn't go outside and confront Frank, not without revealing I was locked in my room. And he couldn't ignore the noise that was now drawing the attention of the whole neighborhood. He paced back and forth in the living room like a caged animal, muttering curses under his breath. Frank just sat in his truck, a stubborn silhouette behind the wheel, his presence a silent act of defiance. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, the truck's engine rumbled back to life. I heard it pull away, but as I wheeled myself to my window, I saw that Frank had left a small brown paper bag on the edge of the porch, right by the steps. It was a message. I waited until the dead of night, until the sound of Jack's snoring was a steady, rhythmic rasp from the living room sofa. Then I went to work. With my small screwdriver, I began to undo the screws on the top hinge of my door. The old metal groaned in protest, each turn of the screw sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. I held my breath, pausing every few seconds, listening for any sign that Jack was stirring. Once the top hinge was free, I moved to the bottom. The work was slow, agonizing for a man in my condition. My back ached, my hip throbbed, and sweat beaded on my forehead. Finally, with the last screw out, I carefully leveraged the heavy oak door away from the frame, just enough to squeeze my wheelchair through. The cool night air on the porch felt like the first breath of a free man. My hands trembled as I reached for the paper bag. Inside, just as I had prayed, was a cheap, disposable cell phone, a burner, and a small folded piece of paper. I unfolded it. Frank's familiar blocky handwriting was a sight for sore eyes. It just said, "Call me, anytime." The tears came then, for the first time in all these long, dark months. They weren't tears of sadness or self-pity. They were tears of overwhelming, gut-wrenching gratitude. The dam of my isolation had finally broken. I was not alone. Someone knew. Someone cared. I sat there on the porch, the cheap plastic of the phone feeling like a holy relic in my hands, and I wept. After a few minutes, I wiped my eyes, my resolve hardening once more. I switched on the phone and dialed the number Frank had written down. He answered on the first ring. "Thomas?" "It's me, Frank," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. And then I told him everything. I spoke in a low, urgent murmur, the words pouring out of me like water from a broken pipe. I told him about the fall, the neglect, the stolen money, the slap, the forged signature, the pawned coins, the drugs, the rat trap, the constant fear. I told him about being locked in my room. Frank listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions or voice any doubt. He just listened, the way only a man who has seen the dark side of the world can listen. When I finally ran out of words, the silence on the line was not empty. It was filled with an unspoken understanding. "All right, Thomas," he finally said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You did good. Now don't you do anything foolish. Me and a few of the boys will be over tomorrow. You just sit tight. We'll handle the rest." That was it. No pity, no shock, just belief, just loyalty. That's the bond between old soldiers. Before the first hint of dawn, I began the arduous task of putting my prison back together. I eased the heavy door back onto its frame, my muscles straining. I painstakingly screwed each hinge back into place, making sure every screw was perfectly aligned, just as it had been before. When I was done, there was no sign that the door had ever been moved. Jack would never know I'd been out. This house, which had been my cell, was now my fortress. That next morning, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I woke up without a knot of fear in my stomach. It was replaced by a strange, profound calm. A soldier's calm. The feeling a man gets when he has done all the preparation he can, and all that's left is to wait for the battle to begin. I sat in my wheelchair by the window, watching the sun climb over the oak trees, my journal and the burner phone hidden safely in my toolbox. I knew they were coming. I just didn't know how. Around 10 o'clock, I heard the first one. A low, familiar rumble. A dusty Ford F-150, the same model as Frank's, pulled up across the street and parked. A few minutes later, another truck, a blue Chevy that belonged to Bill, pulled up behind it. Then a green Dodge Ram, which I knew was Charlie's. One by one they came, 4 old, reliable pickup trucks, parking in a neat, silent line along the curb opposite my house. The engines cut out, and then nothing. They just sat there. Frank, Bill, Charlie, and Dave. 4 old veterans, their faces weathered and grim, staring straight ahead. They didn't get out. They didn't wave. On the dashboard of each truck, I could see the familiar outline of a VFW cap, placed there like a standard. I saw the curtain twitch in the living room. Jack was watching. I could feel his frantic energy from across the house. He came to my door, which he'd left unlocked that morning, a foolish oversight born of his own agitation. His eyes were wide, darting from my face to the street outside and back again. "Who are they?" he demanded, his voice a half-strangled whisper. "Friends of mine," I said, my tone even and calm. "What do they want?" "I couldn't tell you," I replied, looking past him out the window. "Maybe they're just checking in." "Checking in? They look like they're laying siege to the damn house," he sputtered. He ran back to the living room window, peeking through the blinds. One truck might have been a coincidence. A friendly visit. 4 trucks, filled with 4 stone-faced old men, was a declaration. They were a silent, unmovable wall of judgment, a jury of my peers assembled on the street. Their presence was a physical weight, pressing in on the house, on him. They were a message, sent without a single word. "We see you, boy. We're watching." Jack burst back into my room, his carefully constructed composure finally shattering. "What did you tell them?" he shrieked, his voice cracking with panic. "What lies have you been feeding them?" "I haven't said a word to them, Jack," I said, looking him directly in the eye. My calmness seemed to infuriate him even more. "You have to make them leave. Tell them to go. If they don't—" He trailed off, his jaw working, clenching and unclenching. He took a menacing step toward me, his uninjured hand balling into a fist. It was at that exact moment that his cell phone rang. The sudden, shrill noise made him jump. He fumbled it out of his pocket, his eyes still locked on me. He glanced at the screen, and a new wave of fear washed over his face, eclipsing the anger. He turned his back to me, trying to shield the conversation, but in the quiet, tense house, I could hear every desperate word. "Yeah? No, not yet. I'm trying, man. I told you I'm trying," he pleaded into the phone. "Just give me a little more time. A day. Just one more day." It had to be Rico, his dealer, his leash holder. The pressure from the outside, from the silent, watchful eyes of my friends, was now being matched by the pressure from the inside, from the desperate world he had entangled himself in. The trap I had set with a simple phone call was now closing in on him from all sides, and he was the only one caught in its jaws. He hung up, his whole body trembling. He spun around to face me, his face a grotesque mask of fear and rage. He needed a target, someone to blame for the walls caving in on him. "This is your fault," he screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "All of it! You're trying to ruin my life, aren't you? You senile old fool! You probably called them up and told them a bunch of crazy made-up stories. You're losing your mind, old man, that's what this is." He was throwing his last weapon, trying to paint me as the villain, the confused, vindictive elder making things up. It was the last, desperate act of a manipulator who had run out of moves. A few weeks ago, his words might have cut me, might have made me doubt myself, but I wasn't that man anymore. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I didn't say a single word. I just looked at him, and in the silence, he broke. He saw that his words had no more power over me. My silence was a mirror, reflecting his own ugliness back at him, and he couldn't stand to look at it. He let out a choked sob of frustration and rage and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. I sat there in the quiet, listening to the sound of my own steady breathing, and the distant, reassuring presence of 4 American-made engines waiting patiently across the street. The friendship between old men sometimes doesn't need a lot of words. Sometimes just their presence is the most powerful statement you can make. Do you believe in the strength of a true friendship, the kind that can see you through your darkest hours? Let me know your thoughts. Frank and the boys didn't stay parked across the street forever. Their silent vigil lasted for about an hour, a powerful, unspoken statement that had done its job perfectly. But their departure wasn't the end of their involvement. It was the beginning of the next, more critical phase of the plan. Frank wasn't just sitting there to intimidate Jack. He was acting as a watchman while he set the official wheels in motion. He didn't call the police. Old soldiers like us, we have a deep-seated distrust for making a lot of noise when a quiet, strategic move will do. A messy arrest, a public spectacle, that wasn't the goal. The goal was justice, and Frank knew the right channels to go through. From his truck, he made a call, not to 911, but to a number he had looked up, a number for the county's Adult Protective Services. I can almost hear his voice, calm and steady, the way it always was when he was giving a field report. He wouldn't have been emotional. He would have just stated the facts as I'd given them to him. Thomas Carter, a decorated veteran, isolated in his own home, a grandson with erratic, aggressive behavior, a sudden suspicious control over the finances. He painted a picture, not of a crime in progress, but of a situation that required a careful, professional welfare check. He was lighting a signal fire, calling in a different kind of cavalry. At the same time, across town, another gear in the machine was turning. Maria Sanchez at the local bank was a woman of procedure and principle. My desperate whispered call in the middle of the night had shaken her. She had known me and Sarah for years. We'd opened that savings account with her when she was just a new teller. She knew our history, our patterns, the massive withdrawal, the forged signature I hinted at. It was all the confirmation she needed. Following my request and her own gut instinct, she had placed a temporary freeze on my accounts, citing the official need for an in-person signature verification for any further transactions. As expected, Jack had shown up at the bank that morning, furious and desperate. When Maria calmly informed him of the new security measure, he'd reportedly made a scene, yelling and demanding the money. His aggressive, entitled behavior in a public space was the final red flag. It was all the evidence she needed to file an official suspicious activity report, flagging my account for potential elder financial exploitation. 2 separate calls from 2 different people who had never met were now pointing to the same quiet house on Oak Street. The gears of the system, slow but powerful, had begun to turn. The knock came in the afternoon. It wasn't the polite tap of a neighbor or the heavy fist of a friend. It was a firm, official rap on the front door. I was in the living room, and I saw Jack freeze on his way to the kitchen. He crept to the door, peered through the peephole, and I saw the color drain from his face. He stumbled back as if he'd seen a ghost, his eyes wide with terror, landing on me. "Who is it?" I asked, my voice flat, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Nobody," he lied, the word catching in his throat. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. A woman's voice, clear and professional, cut through the wood of the door. "Mr. Jackson Carter? We're with County Social Services. We're here to conduct a welfare check on Mr. Thomas Carter." Checkmate. He had no choice. He couldn't refuse to open the door. With trembling hands, he unlocked it. A middle-aged woman and a younger man stepped inside. They were dressed in business casual attire, their demeanor polite but radiating an unshakable authority. Jack immediately launched into a frantic, clumsy performance. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," he began, his voice slick with false concern. "My grandfather, he's been a little tired lately, resting a lot. I've been so worried." The woman, whose name I would learn was Mrs. Davis, offered him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We won't take up much of his time," she said smoothly. "It's just standard procedure. We just need to speak with him for a few minutes. Alone, if possible." They stepped into the living room, and their professional gaze took in the scene. They saw me, sitting in my wheelchair. They saw the long-sleeved shirt I was wearing despite the afternoon heat, the one hiding the last of the fading bruises. Mrs. Davis's eyes met mine. There was no pity in her look, none of the condescension I had grown to dread. There was only a calm, quiet understanding. In that single, fleeting moment, I knew. I knew I didn't have to scream. I didn't have to cry. She had seen this 100 times before. She already knew the story. All I had to do was give her the first chapter. Jack hovered nervously, trying to answer every question for me. "Oh, he's been a bit forgetful lately, you know how it is," he'd interrupt. "His memory isn't what it used to be." Mrs. Davis nodded, her eyes still on me. "Is that so?" she said, then addressed me directly. "Mr. Carter, can you tell me? Do you feel safe in your own home?" Before Jack could jump in with another lie. "Of course he's safe. I take wonderful care of him." I acted. I didn't say a word. I held the social worker's gaze. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into the breast pocket of my shirt. I pulled out the small, worn-out notebook. With a steady hand, I placed it on the small table next to my chair. The sound it made in the silent room was no louder than a whisper, but it landed with the force of a gavel. Every eye in the room, Jack's, the young man's, Mrs. Davis's, snapped to the little book. It sat there, unassuming and plain. But we all knew what it was. It was a record. It was a weapon. It was the truth. Jack's desperate, frantic performance had just reached its final act. When I placed the notebook on the table, the air in the room seemed to solidify. All the frantic, lying energy that Jack had been spewing into the space was sucked into that one small object. Mrs. Davis, the social worker, picked it up. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she held it in her hand and looked at Jack, her expression unreadable but intensely focused. Then her gaze shifted to me. Her eyes were clear, and they held a silent question that I understood perfectly. It was an offer, a final chance for the truth to come out on its own terms. "I'm giving you one last chance to do the right thing," her look seemed to say to Jack. I saw him swallow hard, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. The hunter had become the hunted, trapped in the glare of a calm, professional gaze. He tried one last time, a desperate, pathetic bluff. That's just his journal," Jack stammered, attempting a smile that was more of a grimace. "He writes all sorts of things in there. Ramblings, you know. His memory, it gets mixed up." Mrs. Davis didn't even honor him with a response. Her attention was solely on the book. She opened it to the first page. I watched her eyes move, scanning my clumsy old man's handwriting. I saw her eyebrows knit together almost imperceptibly as she read. I knew what she was seeing. She was reading the date I started wearing long-sleeved shirts. She was reading the entry about the slap, the one where I described the sound it made in the quiet room. She was reading about the missing pain pills, the pawn ticket for my father's coins, the name Rico from the text messages. She was reading the indictment I had written in the dark. After a few long moments, she closed the notebook and looked up, her gaze once again bypassing me and landing squarely on Jack. "Thank you, Jack," she said, her voice still gentle but now laced with steel. "We need to speak with Mr. Carter privately now, if you wouldn't mind waiting for us on the front porch." "But I'm his caregiver," he protested, his voice a weak bleat. "That's precisely why," the young man beside her said, speaking for the first time. His tone was firm. "We need to speak with him alone." Jack shot one last look at me. It was a venomous cocktail of raw hatred and pure animal terror. Defeated, he shuffled out of the living room, a predator who had just been stripped of his claws and teeth. The moment the porch door clicked shut, the heavy, threatening atmosphere in the room evaporated. Mrs. Davis pulled a chair closer to my wheelchair. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, her voice filled with a professional empathy that was a world away from pity. "You don't have to say anything you're not comfortable with. But would you be willing to show us your arm?" I looked at her, then at her young colleague, who stood respectfully by the door. I didn't speak. I simply, slowly, began to roll up the sleeve of my flannel shirt. The bruise was still there, a sickly mottled patch of yellow and green against my pale, thin skin. Mrs. Davis drew in a soft, sharp breath. It was a sound of confirmation, not surprise. "And your bedroom door, Mr. Carter," she continued, her voice even. "Is it true that it was locked from the outside?" I just nodded. It was that simple. The truth didn't need to be shouted. It didn't need tears or hysterics. It had a weight and a power all its own, and in that quiet room, it was crushing. They stayed with me for another 10 minutes, asking simple, direct questions that I answered with nods or short, quiet phrases. Then Mrs. Davis went outside to speak with Jack. I couldn't hear her words, but I heard his. The tone of his voice had changed completely. The aggressive, bullying rage was gone, replaced by a high-pitched, desperate whine. "Please, don't do this," I heard him beg through the door. He's confused sometimes. I love him. I swear. I love my grandpa. I'll lose everything." It was the pathetic sound of a coward who had been cornered, the whimpering of a bully stripped of all his power. He was no longer a monster. He was just a terrified boy, finally facing the consequences of his own cruelty. A few minutes later, the living room door opened again. Mrs. Davis and her partner walked in, with Jack trailing between them. His face was blotchy and streaked with tears. He looked utterly broken. And then he did something that I never in a million years would have expected. He stumbled forward and fell to his knees beside my wheelchair, his hands gripping the worn armrests. "Grandpa," he sobbed, his hot tears falling onto my hand. "Grandpa, please tell them. Tell them it was all a misunderstanding. Tell them I take good care of you. Tell them you love me. Please, Grandpa, please." The entire world seemed to shrink down to that single moment. The power, the control, the final decision. It was all mine. With a single word I could save him. I could lie, and this would all probably go away. Or I could save myself. I looked down at the weeping figure at my knees. I searched his face, trying to see the little boy I used to take fishing, trying to see my daughter's smile, trying to see the ghost of my wife's hopes for him. But there was nothing there. The love, the memories, the shared blood. It had all been burned away, leaving behind only the hollowed-out shell of a person I no longer recognized. I was looking at a stranger. I looked down at the weeping figure kneeling at my feet, his tears splashing onto the worn leather of my old work boots. The entire world, which for months had been a chaotic storm of fear and pain, had shrunk down to this one silent moment. All the power he had stolen from me piece by piece was now laid at my feet, offered up in a desperate, slobbering plea. He was giving me a choice. I could save him with a lie, or I could save myself with the truth. I searched his face, desperately trying to find a flicker of the little boy I used to take fishing, a shadow of my daughter's smile, a ghost of the man my wife, Sarah, had hoped he would become. But there was nothing there. The love, the memories, the shared blood, it had all been burned away, leaving behind only the hollowed-out shell of a person I no longer recognized. I was looking at a stranger. I felt nothing, not pity, not even hatred, just a vast, cold emptiness where my love for him used to be. I slowly shook my head. "No," I said. My voice didn't tremble. It was as clear and solid as a piece of old-growth oak. "It's enough now, Jack." The last glimmer of hope in his eyes died, replaced by a look of pure, stunned disbelief. He stared at me as if I had just spoken in a foreign language. That one word was the signal. Mrs. Davis gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to her young colleague. He immediately went to work, his movements quiet and efficient. He pulled out his phone and began taking pictures of the ugly, fading bruise on my arm. He then moved to my bedroom, documenting the crude lock Jack had installed on the outside of the door. Mrs. Davis, meanwhile, held my little notebook. She began to read from it, not to herself, but aloud. Her voice wasn't dramatic or accusatory. It was the flat procedural tone of an official entering evidence into the record. "Pushed against the doorframe," she read. $20 missing from wallet. Arm grabbed and squeezed. The slap. Each phrase, spoken in her calm, dispassionate voice, was another hammer blow, another nail being driven into the coffin of Jack's elaborate fiction. The private pains I had scribbled down in the dark were now being brought into the light, given weight and legitimacy by the system itself. I heard the sound then, faint at first, then growing steadily closer. The distant wail of a siren. A few minutes later, a police car pulled quietly into the driveway. 2 uniformed officers came to the door, which Mrs. Davis opened for them. There was no rush, no shouting. They were calm, professional. They'd clearly been briefed. One officer, a tall man with a kind, tired face, came over to me. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice gentle. "Are you injured? Do you need any medical attention?" I just shook my head. The other officer approached Jack, who was still slumped on the floor, a picture of pathetic defeat. The final confrontation wasn't a shouting match or a physical struggle. It was a process, cold, methodical, and utterly irreversible. The machine of justice had arrived, and it moved at its own deliberate, unstoppable pace. "There's one more thing," I said, my voice quiet but firm. The officer talking to me turned, attentive. I pointed with my chin toward Jack's bedroom. "In his room, under the bed, there's a velvet box. My father's watch is in it. There's something else in there with it." The officer nodded and disappeared into Jack's room. He was back in less than a minute, holding the dark blue velvet box. He opened it in front of all of us. There, gleaming against the worn fabric, was my father's gold watch. And nestled right beside it, stark and ugly, was the little plastic baggie of white powder. The final, undeniable piece of proof. The officers didn't hesitate. One of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The sound of the metal ratchet clicking shut echoed in the quiet wooden house. It was a small sound, but it was the sound of my liberation. As they led Jack past me, his shoulders slumped. He wouldn't look at me. He couldn't. The grandson who had been the repository of all my hopes was now just another addict, another criminal being led away. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt a profound, weary sadness for a life that had been so thoroughly and deliberately thrown away. But underneath the sadness, for the first time in so long, I felt the muscles in my chest unclench. I could breathe. When they were all gone, Jack, the police, the young social worker, only Mrs. Davis and I remained. The silence that fell upon the house was different. It wasn't the heavy, threatening silence of before. It was a clean, peaceful quiet. She walked over and gently placed my notebook back on the table beside me. "You were very brave, Mr. Carter," she said. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. My gaze fell upon the floor, to the scattered, glittering shards of Sarah's porcelain wind chimes. They were still there, a testament to the storm that had passed through this house. But looking at them now, they weren't a symbol of what I had lost. They were a monument. A memorial to the exact moment the war began. A war that, against all odds, I had just won. This house was mine again. After that day, a heavy, medicinal quiet fell over the house. Jack was gone, forced out by a temporary restraining order the court issued immediately. Mrs. Davis arranged for a home care aide, a kind, quiet woman named Alice, to come by every day to help with meals and other necessities. The silence in the house was no longer threatening, but it was thick with the weight of what was to come. The immediate danger had passed, but I knew this was just a ceasefire, not a surrender. The real war, the one to be fought with words and evidence in a sterile courtroom, was still ahead. The intimidation tactics started a few days later. The old landline phone, which had been silent for months, began to ring at odd hours, late at night or just as the sun was rising. I'd wheel myself over and pick up the receiver. There was never a voice on the other end. Just the faint, empty hiss of an open line, a breath held in the darkness, and then the soft click of them hanging up. The first time, it sent a jolt of fear through me, but after the second and third time, the fear was replaced by a grim resolve. I knew it was either Jack, trying to rattle me from a distance, or worse, the people he owed money to, sending a message. They were trying to scare me into silence, hoping I'd drop the charges. I'd simply place the receiver back in its cradle. Their empty threats were nothing. Their silence couldn't possibly be more terrifying than the silence I had already lived through. The preparation for the hearing began in earnest. Mrs. Davis returned, this time with a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Albright, assigned by social services. We sat in my living room, around the sturdy coffee table I had built decades ago. I still hadn't cleaned up the porcelain shards of Sarah's wind chimes. They lay in a corner, a silent testament to the breaking point. With a tape recorder running, I told my story again, from the very beginning. This time, it wasn't just a desperate confession. It was a formal deposition. Each word was carefully recorded, each memory converted into a piece of a legal puzzle. My little notebook, which had started as the ramblings of a desperate old man, was carefully placed in a plastic sleeve. It was now Exhibit A. The pawnshop receipt for my father's coins became Exhibit B. A sworn affidavit from Maria at the bank, detailing Jack's aggressive behavior and the frozen account, was Exhibit C. The system was building a fortress of facts around me. I was no longer a confused elder. I was a witness for the prosecution. Despite all this, the night before the court date, the old fear came crawling back. Sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed staring into the darkness, and the monster of shame, the one I thought I had conquered, began to whisper in my ear. I was about to air my family's dirty laundry in front of a room full of strangers. I was about to publicly declare that my own grandson, the boy I had raised, was a thief and an addict. The whispers turned into accusations. Where did you go wrong? How could you let this happen in your own house? You failed him. You failed your daughter. You failed Sarah. It was a heavy, suffocating weight, the fear that the world would see me not as a victim, but as a failure. Around 10 o'clock, the burner phone Frank had given me vibrated on the nightstand. I expected it to be another silent, intimidating call that had somehow gotten this number. My hand trembled slightly as I answered. "Thomas? It's Frank." His voice was a low, steady rumble, an anchor in the storm of my anxiety. There was no pity in it, just strength. "Just calling to say we'll be there tomorrow, in the back row. You're not walking in there alone." Before I could even properly respond, he hung up. A minute later, the phone buzzed again. It was Bill. "See you in the morning, Thomas." Then Charlie. "We got your 6, buddy." They didn't say much. They didn't need to. They were just letting me know. They would be my wall. I looked out the window, past the dark silhouette of the oak tree, toward my workshop. I was not alone. I pushed myself up and got back in my wheelchair. I rolled over to the small table by my armchair and picked up a scrap piece of oak left over from some long-forgotten project. From my toolbox, I took my old carving knife, the handle worn smooth from a lifetime of use. I didn't have a plan. I just started to whittle. The blade made a soft, rhythmic scraping sound as it peeled away thin curls of wood. The familiar scent of oak filled the air. My hands, which had been trembling just moments before, were now steady. These were the hands that had built this house, that had held my wife, that had raised my daughter. Tomorrow, they would help me rebuild my dignity. I didn't know what I was carving, and it didn't matter. The act itself was a prayer, a meditation. This was how a carpenter prepares for battle. Through his work, through the quiet, steady strength of his own 2 hands. The morning of the hearing, Frank picked me up in his old Ford. He didn't say much, just gave me a firm nod as I settled into the passenger seat, my wooden cane resting between my knees. As we pulled up to the county courthouse, a stately old brick building I had only ever seen from the outside, I saw them, just like he promised. Bill's Chevy and Charlie's Dodge were parked across the street. The men were leaning against their trucks, coffee cups in hand, wearing their navy blue VFW jackets. They weren't there to cause a scene. They didn't need to come inside. Their presence on the courthouse steps was the only statement that mattered. As I got out of the truck and stood up straight, leaning on my cane, they all straightened up too. In silent, perfect unison, they raised their hands in a crisp, military salute. A quiet, profound acknowledgement from one old soldier to another. I met their gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod in return. In that moment, surrounded by the unwavering loyalty of my brothers, I felt my spine straighten. I felt an inch taller. The courtroom itself was cold and imposing, all dark wood paneling and towering ceilings that seemed to swallow sound. It smelled of old paper and lemon polish, the scent of order and consequence. There was a quiet hum of activity, lawyers whispering to their clients, a bailiff standing impassively by the judge's bench. The formality of it all, the structured, predictable nature of the proceedings, was strangely comforting. It was the complete opposite of the chaotic, unpredictable terror I had been living in. Then I saw him. Jack was sitting at the defendant's table next to a weary-looking public defender. He was dressed in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his thin frame. His skin was pale and sallow, and he stared down at his hands, refusing to look at me, refusing to meet my eyes. He looked small and insignificant in that big, important room. The proceedings began, and Maria from the bank was the first to be called to the stand. She was poised and professional, her voice clear and steady as she recounted the events of the past few weeks. She spoke about my frantic, whispered call in the middle of the night. She described Jack's aggressive, belligerent behavior when he came into the bank and found the account frozen, how his rage had been so alarming that she had felt compelled to file a formal report. She didn't embellish or add emotion. She just laid out the facts one after another like a mason laying bricks. The gears of the system were turning, cold, precise, and powerful. Next came Mrs. Davis, the social worker. She was just as composed. She presented my little notebook to the court, the one that had been my only confidant in the darkness. She showed the judge the photographs her colleague had taken. The ugly fading bruise on my arm, the crude lock on the outside of my bedroom door. Her testimony was methodical, weaving together my scattered, desperate notes into an undeniable tapestry of abuse, neglect, and imprisonment. With every word she spoke, I could see Jack sinking lower in his chair, his head bowed, his charade utterly and completely dismantled, and then they called my name. The prosecution calls Thomas Carter. My legs felt unsteady as I made my way to the witness stand, the sound of my cane tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm on the polished floor. But as I sat down in the witness chair, and the bailiff asked me to place my hand on the Bible, a wave of calm washed over me. The same calm I had felt the night before, with a piece of oak in my hands. The oath was a promise, and I was a man who kept his promises. I didn't look at Jack. I didn't need to. I looked directly at the judge, an older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through everything. And I told my story. I didn't tell it with anger or with the brokenness of a victim. I didn't raise my voice or shed a tear. I told it like a carpenter describing a house that had been built with faulty materials. I laid out the foundation of trust I had placed in my grandson. I pointed out the first cracks that appeared, the small cruelties, the missing money. I described the structural damage, the slap, the forged signature, the shattered wind chimes, the terror. I spoke of the rot that had set in, the drugs and the lies that had hollowed him out from the inside. I was just presenting the facts, describing the flaws in the construction, explaining with a heavy heart why the whole damn thing had to be torn down. When I finished, a profound silence fell over the courtroom. Not the empty, threatening silence of a dead phone line, not the suffocating, fearful silence of my house. It was a silence filled with weight and consideration. A silence that listened. In that moment, I felt a burden I hadn't even realized I was carrying begin to lift from my shoulders. For months, my voice had been stolen from me, replaced by shame and fear. But now, I had taken it back. I had spoken my truth in a place where the truth mattered. Whatever the judge's final verdict would be, I knew deep in my bones that I had already won the most important battle of all. I had won the war against my own shame. The judge called for a brief recess before she delivered her final ruling. The tension in the courtroom seemed to exhale in a collective, silent sigh. As a bailiff began to escort me toward a side door, Jack's public defender, a young man who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, hurried to intercept us. "Mr. Carter, please," he said, his voice low and urgent. "My client, Jack, he's begging to speak with you for just 1 minute. Privately." I hesitated. A part of me, the part that was bone-weary and just wanted this all to be over, wanted to refuse. What more could possibly be said? But another part, the part that needed to see this through to its absolute end, knew I had to do it. I needed to face him one last time, not in a courtroom filled with strangers, but as the two people who were once family. I gave a slow nod. They led us to a small, featureless room down the hall. It was little more than a closet with a table and a few chairs. A single fluorescent light hummed overhead, casting a pale, sickly glow on everything. A uniformed guard stood impassively by the door, his arms crossed. Jack was brought in, his wrists still cuffed in front of him. The swaggering, monstrous rage I had seen in my house was gone. The cold, calculating thief was gone. The snarling, cornered animal was gone. All that was left was a boy, a pale, terrified boy drowning in an orange jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too big. "Grandpa," he began, his voice breaking on the word. He couldn't even look at me. His eyes were fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. "Grandpa, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." And then the dam broke. The words came tumbling out of him in a torrent of self-pity and excuses. He started talking about the money he owed, about Rico and the threats he'd made, about how the addiction had its hooks in him so deep he couldn't think straight anymore. The tears he had been holding back now flowed freely, tracing clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. "I never wanted to hurt you," he sobbed, his whole body shaking. "You have to believe me, I was backed into a corner. I didn't know what else to do. They were going to kill me, Grandpa." I listened. I let him talk. I'd spent a lifetime listening. I listened as he painted a picture of himself as the victim. A man swept away by forces beyond his control. He spoke of his choices as if they were things that had happened to him, not things he had done. He was trying to find some common ground, some sliver of empathy he could use as a foothold to climb out of the hole he had dug for himself. He was trying to explain the unexplainable, to justify the unforgivable. Then, his voice dropped to a desperate, pleading whisper. "Please, Grandpa," he begged, finally looking up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "Please, just talk to the judge. Tell her you forgive me. Remind her I'm all the family you've got left. Maybe she'll go easy on me. Maybe I won't have to go to prison. Please, Grandpa, I don't want to go to prison." And there it was, the raw, unvarnished truth. The apology wasn't for me. The tears weren't for the pain he had caused. They were for him. All of this was for him. His sorrow was entirely self-contained. He wasn't asking for forgiveness to heal my wounds. He was asking for it as a tool, a key to unlock a door to a lesser sentence. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment after he finished. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and the last vestiges of love and obligation I felt for him finally withered and turned to dust. "Jack," I said, and I was surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. There was no anger in it. There was no hatred, just a profound, bottomless exhaustion. "You had so many choices. Every step of the way you had a choice. You could have come to me. You could have asked for help. Your friends, Frank and Bill and Charlie, they would have moved heaven and earth for my grandson. But you chose. You chose to lie. You chose to steal. And you chose to hurt the one person on this earth who loved you unconditionally." I paused, letting the weight of the words settle in the small room. "You see this like it's a storm that happened to you, but it's not. It's a house. A house you built, board by board, with every bad choice you made, and then you deliberately set it on fire." I leaned forward, my hands gripping the handle of my cane. I pushed myself up to my feet, the tip of the cane making a soft, definitive tap on the floor. "Family doesn't do what you did," I said, my voice quiet but absolute. "And forgiveness isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card, Jack. It's not a tool you use to escape the consequences of your actions. It's something you have to earn. And son," I looked at him one last time, "you haven't even started the work." I turned my back on him then and walked toward the door. The guard stepped aside to let me pass. I didn't look back. I no longer felt the burn of hatred or the sting of betrayal. All I felt, as I walked out of that room and left him to his fate, was a final, cleansing release. When I walked back into the courtroom, following the bailiff, the air was thick with a heavy, final silence. My steps, aided by my cane, seemed impossibly loud on the polished floor, each tap a small punctuation mark in the story's final chapter. Jack was led back to the defendant's table. If he had looked like a scared boy in the small conference room, he now looked like a ghost. His eyes were red-rimmed and utterly vacant, staring at a point on the wall that only he could see. He knew, as I knew, that the time for pleas and manipulations was over. A bailiff called out, "All rise!" And we stood as the judge, a man with a mane of silver hair and a deeply lined face that spoke of decades spent weighing the sins of others, re-entered the room and took his seat. He took his time, shuffling the papers before him, his silence a deliberate act that amplified the tension. This wasn't a show for him. It was a solemn duty, and he treated it with the gravity it deserved. Finally, he looked over his spectacles, his gaze settling on Jack for a long, quiet moment, a look of profound disappointment. "Defendant Jack Carter," he began, his voice not loud, but carrying a weight and timbre that filled every corner of the solemn room. "This court has heard the testimony of the witnesses. This court has reviewed the evidence presented." He paused, and his hand reached over to pick up my small, worn notebook from the evidence table. He held it up slightly, not for anyone else to see, but as if to feel its weight. "And this court," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "has read these words, the words of a man who was made a prisoner in his own home." He placed the notebook down gently, as if it were a sacred text. "Let me be clear. This is not merely a case of theft and assault, as reprehensible as those acts are. This is a case about a betrayal of trust in its most depraved form. The defendant took advantage of the extreme vulnerability of his own grandfather, the man who raised him, the man who housed him, the man who, by all accounts, loved him unconditionally, to feed his own selfish addictions and weaknesses." The judge leaned forward, his eyes boring into Jack, who seemed to shrink under the intensity of his gaze, his head sinking lower and lower. "You took a home, a place of safety and memory, a place built with the hands of the very man you were supposed to be caring for, and you turned it into a prison. You systematically stripped him not only of his possessions and his life savings, but of his dignity, his connections to the outside world, and his peace of mind. You used his love as a weapon against him, and his failing health as an opportunity. There are few violations more profound, more despicable, than the abuse of the elderly, especially when the abuser is family, the one person who should have been a shield against the world." I sat there listening, and I felt no surge of victory, no thrill of revenge, just a quiet, solemn affirmation. To hear the truth, my truth, spoken with such clarity and authority by another person, by the system itself, was to feel the twisted knots of shame and self-doubt inside me finally begin to loosen their hold. The judge cleared his throat, his expression grim and resolute. "Therefore, on the charges of felony elder abuse, grand theft, forgery, and possession of a controlled substance," he declared, his voice ringing with finality, "this court sentences the defendant, Jack Carter, to 5 years in the state penitentiary. This sentence is to be followed by a mandatory court-supervised drug rehabilitation and psychological counseling program upon his release. Let the record show that this sentence is intended not only as a punishment, but as a stark message that this community will protect its most vulnerable members." I heard a soft, collective exhale from the bench behind me, where Frank, Bill, and Charlie were sitting. It was a sound of profound relief, justice. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, methodical, and absolute. 2 bailiffs moved toward Jack. He didn't resist. He seemed to have no fight left in him, a puppet whose strings had been cut. They had him stand, his movements clumsy and slow, and they turned him around to face away from the judge. One of the bailiffs took out a pair of handcuffs. In the hushed courtroom, the sound of the metal ratchet was sharp and clear. Click, click, click. The sound of a lock turning. The sound of a final, irreversible consequence. It was the last sound I would ever need to hear from him. As they led him past my table, our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I had expected to see hatred or rage or even a last glimmer of pleading. But there was nothing. Only a vast, hollow emptiness. A void. And in that moment, I realized that maybe, just maybe in some small, buried part of his broken soul, he knew this was how it had to be. This was the only way his self-made fire could be put out. The courtroom slowly emptied out. The lawyers packed their briefcases. The clerk gathered her files. Frank and the boys came up to me, their hands resting on my shoulder. "It's over, Thomas," Frank said, his voice gruff with emotion. "It's finally over." I looked around the empty room, at the polished wood and the American flag standing in the corner. Everything had been said. Everything had been decided. The storm had passed. I didn't feel the cathartic joy I thought I might. Instead, I felt a deep, quiet peace settling into my bones, a peace I hadn't felt since the day I fell off that roof. I hadn't just won back my house. I hadn't just gotten justice. I had reclaimed something far more valuable. I had gotten myself back. That night, after the verdict, the house was quieter than it had been in months. But for the first time, it was a good quiet, a peaceful quiet. Ms. Davis had arranged for a home care nurse to stay with me for the first few nights, just to make sure I was all right. The police had come by and placed an evidence seal on Jack's bedroom door, a stark, official-looking piece of tape that felt like a final period at the end of a very long, very ugly sentence. I sat in my living room for a long time, just listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, sounds I hadn't truly heard in ages. That night I slept. I truly slept. There were no nightmares, no waking with a start at every creak of the floorboards. The silence was no longer a threat. It was a comfort. Justice, I realized, sometimes arrives as quietly as the pain did. The next morning, Frank and the boys from the VFW came over. They didn't come to talk or sit around drinking coffee. They came to work. Men of their generation show they care with their hands, not with their words. Without being asked, they started the process of purging my house of its ghosts. They went into Jack's room. The police had given them permission to clear it out. And they were ruthless. Old clothes, dirty magazines, the lingering smell of stale smoke and despair. Everything went into heavy-duty trash bags. Frank took a crowbar to the flimsy lock Jack had installed on the outside of my bedroom door, prying it off with a grunt of satisfaction. Bill, who was handier with that sort of thing, installed a brand-new solid brass deadbolt on my front door. "Nobody's getting in here that you don't want in here," he said, and it felt like the most reassuring sentence I'd ever heard. My friend Charlie, another carpenter, took on the saddest task. He knelt on the floor, his old knees creaking, and began to carefully pick up the shattered pieces of Sarah's porcelain wind chimes. I had left them there, on the oak floorboards, as a reminder of what I was fighting for. He didn't sweep them into a dustpan. He handled each piece as if it were a precious jewel, placing them carefully into a small cardboard box. He slid the box onto a bookshelf. "We'll figure out what to do with these later," was all he said, and I was grateful. He understood they weren't just broken things. They were broken memories. There was one task, however, that no one could do for me. I had to call my sister Ellen, Jack's mother. She lived 3 states away, and our calls had become less frequent over the years. It was the hardest phone call I've ever had to make. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone, my hand hovering over the receiver. Then I picked it up and dialed. I told her everything. I didn't soften it. I didn't edit it. I just laid the truth out, plain and unvarnished. She was silent for a long time on the other end of the line, and then I heard the first choked sob. She wept for her son, for the boy she remembered, and I wept with her. I wept for the grandson I had lost, and for the poison that had taken him. This pain wasn't just mine. It had roots, and it had branches, and it had touched people who didn't deserve it. A week later, I took my first real step back into the world. I used my new cell phone to call a wheelchair-accessible taxi service. I had them take me to the bank. When I rolled through the doors, Maria saw me from her teller window, and her face broke into a wide, genuine smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter," she said, and it felt like she meant more than just welcome back to the bank. I sat at her desk, and with a hand that was surprisingly steady, I signed the withdrawal slip myself. I took out a small amount of cash just to have in my wallet. It was such a simple act, an everyday transaction, But to me, it felt as significant as driving the first nail into the frame of a house. It was foundational. I was reclaiming my life, one small, deliberate signature at a time. The first thing I did with that money was get rid of the sofa. It was a lumpy, stained thing in the living room where Jack had slept and festered. It was soaked in bad memories. I called Frank, and he came over with his truck without a single question. We wrestled it out the front door, and he hauled it away to the dump. Later that day, I did something I'd never done before in my 70 years. I went online. I looked up recliners, and I ordered myself a brand new top-of-the-line La-Z-Boy. Brown leather. The kind with a lever on the side that makes you feel like you're piloting a spaceship. A few days later, 2 young men delivered it, setting it right where the old sofa used to be. That evening, I sat down in my new chair, the rich smell of new leather filling the room. I pulled the lever, and my feet went up. And sitting there, in the quiet of my own living room, in a chair I had chosen and bought for myself, I felt like a king on his throne. The process of healing after a trauma is never easy. It takes help from friends and the courage to face the past. What do you think is the most important small step a person can take to begin rebuilding their life? The days after the trial were quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. The silence was no longer a weapon used against me. It was a space I could finally fill with my own life. The first thing I did was reclaim the sounds of my home. I went out to the dusty storage shed, and after a bit of searching, I found it. My old workshop radio. It was a simple beat-up thing. A boxy AM/FM receiver covered in a fine layer of sawdust and forgotten memories. Jack had banished it out here, complaining that the noise gave him a headache. I carried it back inside, wiped it down with a damp cloth, plugged it in, and turned the dial. The familiar, crackling sound of an old-time country music station filled the living room. The sound of a pedal steel guitar felt like blood returning to a limb that had been asleep for too long. I started listening to the news again in the mornings, the weather report, the local talk shows. The mundane, everyday sounds of the world started to seep back into the foundation of my house, and with them, a sense of normalcy I thought I had lost forever. With the sounds of life returning, I turned my attention to its scars. Charlie had saved the pieces of Sarah's wind chimes in a cardboard box, and for a long time, I just left it on the shelf. Looking at it was painful, but one afternoon, a memory surfaced. I recalled reading an article years ago in one of my woodworking magazines about a Japanese art form called kintsugi. It was the craft of repairing broken pottery, not by hiding the cracks, but by mending them with lacquer mixed with powdered gold, silver, or platinum. The philosophy behind it was that the piece was more beautiful for having been broken, that the scars were part of its history, a testament to its resilience. The idea took root. I wouldn't throw her memory away. I would honor the damage. I took the box to my workshop. The physical therapy was helping, and I was getting stronger on my feet, able to stand at my workbench for short periods. I laid the porcelain shards out on a clean cloth like pieces of a complex puzzle. I didn't have gold lacquer, but a carpenter always has his ways. I found a special epoxy, clear and strong, and a small jar of fine brass powder I'd used for inlay work. The process was slow, meditative. It took all my patience, all the steadiness left in my hands. I'd apply the epoxy to the edge of one piece, dust it with the brass powder, and then fit it against its mate, holding it perfectly still until it set. Each tiny piece was a victory. Each new seam of shimmering brass was a scar I was choosing to honor. It was a quiet rebellion against the violence that had shattered them. As my hip healed, so did my connection to the world. I could walk with just a cane now, the wheelchair relegated to a corner. The first time I drove my truck again, the feeling of the steering wheel in my hands was a declaration of independence. I didn't go to the grocery store or the hardware store. I drove straight to the VFW post. When I walked in, the familiar smell of stale coffee and old stories hit me. A few heads turned, and then a slow smile spread across Frank's face. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he bellowed. The whole room erupted in cheers and applause. They welcomed me back not as a victim, but as a brother who had been through a private war and come out the other side. We didn't talk about what happened. We didn't need to. We just played cards, drank coffee that was too strong, and told the same old lies about how brave we were back in the day. In that room, surrounded by men who understood the language of silence and solidarity, I wasn't a case number. I was Thomas, a soldier, a carpenter, a friend. One day a letter arrived with a postmark from the state penitentiary. It was from Jack. My first instinct was to throw it away, unopened. But I didn't. I sat in my new lazy boy and read it. He wrote that he was sorry, that the rehab program was forcing him to see things clearly for the first time. He didn't ask for my forgiveness, which surprised me. He just said he wanted me to know that he regretted it all, that he was trying to understand the man he had become. I read the letter twice, then folded it and put it away in a drawer. Forgiveness is a long road, and I wasn't ready to take the first step. Maybe one day, or maybe never. But reading his words, I felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a distant, mournful sadness for the boy he could have been. After weeks of patient work, the wind chimes were whole again. They weren't perfect. They never would be. A web of fine, golden bronze lines crisscrossed the white porcelain, mapping out the story of their destruction and rebirth. But they were complete. I took them out to the front porch and hung them in the exact same spot where they had always been. A breeze drifted through the oak trees, and for the first time in almost a year, the clear, delicate notes rang out. The sound was different now, deeper, more resonant, as if the memory of the fall had added a new layer of harmony. It was the sound of my own healing. My leg was strong enough now. I could move around my workshop with a new confidence. The space felt like mine again. I found an old, seasoned block of oak, a piece I'd been saving for something special, and clamped it to my workbench. I picked up my favorite carving knife. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what it would become, but as I made the first long, curling cut, the familiar scrape of steel on wood and the rich, earthy smell of sawdust filled the air. It was the best medicine in the world. I wasn't rebuilding the past. I was carving something new. You know, for the longest time, I thought winning the fight was the end of the story. It turns out it was just the end of a chapter. The real story, the one that matters more, started quietly a few months later, over a lukewarm cup of coffee at the VFW Post. Bill was one of the quiet ones, a guy who'd sit at the end of the bar, nod when you came in, and nurse the same beer for an hour. We'd known each other for 20 years and probably hadn't exchanged more than 100 words, but that day he pulled me aside, back by the dusty pool table that no one ever used. He kept looking over his shoulder, like he was about to share a state secret. He told me he'd been having some trouble with his son. Something about money and papers he didn't understand. He was scared, but he didn't know who to talk to. Then he looked me straight in the eye, and his voice dropped to a near whisper. "Hearing your story, Carter," he said, "it made me realize I wasn't alone." Those words just stopped me in my tracks. It was like a switch had been flipped in a dark room. All this time I had been so focused on my own battle, my own four walls. I never considered that my fight could be a light for someone else walking in the same darkness. My story wasn't just mine anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my old armchair, the one Mary always said I'd be buried in, and just thought. I thought about the shame that had kept me silent for so long. The feeling that I'd failed, that I should have been stronger, smarter. It's a heavy coat to wear, that kind of shame. And I realized so many men my age were wearing it. We come from a generation that was taught to be self-reliant, to be the rock. You don't complain, you don't ask for help, you just bear it. But sometimes the weight is too much to bear alone, and maybe, just maybe, the greatest strength wasn't in the silence. Maybe it was in having the guts to finally speak up. The next morning I called Frank. I met him for breakfast at the diner, and over pancakes I laid out an idea. "What if we started something at the VFW?" I said. "Not some official, fancy-name support group. Nothing like that." He grimaced at the thought, and I knew I was on the right track. Just a corner, I explained. A place for guys like us to go. We could call it the Old Soldier's Woodshop. We bring in some tools, work on some small projects, drink some coffee, and if a man wants to talk, he can, safely. Frank listened, slowly chewing his bacon. He looked out the window for a long moment, then back at me. A slow smile spread across his face. "I think you're onto something, Carter," he said. Our first meeting was just 4 of us. Me, Frank, Bill, and another fella named Charlie. We didn't sit in a circle and talk about our feelings. God, no. We set up a couple of sawhorses in the back room of the VFW and started carving little wooden birds from scraps of pine. The air was filled with the gentle rasp of sandpaper and the smell of sawdust. For the first hour, nobody said much of anything. But in that quiet, comfortable work, the stories started to come out. Not in a rush, but in trickles. Charlie mentioned a son who lived 1,000 miles away and never called. Bill talked more about his financial fears. I talked about the feeling of being invisible in your own life. There were no judgments, no easy answers. There was just the shared understanding of men who had seen a thing or two, working with their hands and finding a bit of solid ground together. Slowly, the word got around. A couple more guys showed up the next week, then a couple more. We started making wooden toys, little cars and spinning tops, and donated them to the children's ward at the local hospital. People in town started bringing us their broken chairs and wobbly tables, and we'd fix them up, no charge. Each piece we finished wasn't just wood and nails. It was proof that we were still useful, that our hands could still build, still mend, that we still had value. I used to think my legacy was that house, the one built with oak and sweat. I was so proud of it, of leaving something solid behind. But sitting in that workshop, watching Bill show Charlie how to round the edge on a toy truck, I realized I was wrong. A real legacy isn't something you leave for people. It's something you build in people. It's a community, a safe harbor, a place where no one has to fight their battles alone. One afternoon, Maria from the bank stopped by the VFW. She was off the clock, just brought a box of cookies for the guys. She stood in the doorway for a minute, just watching us. The hum of the sander, the laughter as Frank told a bad joke. She had this big, genuine smile on her face. "You're building something wonderful here, Mr. Carter," she said softly. I looked around at my friends, my brothers, sawing, sanding, laughing. Men who had been shouldering their burdens in silence were now sharing them over a workbench. "It wasn't me," I said, and it was the truest thing I'd ever said in my life. It was us. I'm sitting on the porch again. It's early Sunday morning, the kind of morning that feels like a clean slate. The air, washed clean by an overnight rain, is cool against my skin and carries the deep, earthy smell of the oak trees in the yard. It's a scent so woven into the fabric of my life, it feels like it's part of my own memory, my own bones. I'm holding a warm mug of coffee, the steam rising in gentle spirals into the quiet air. So much of this scene is the same as it has been for 40 years, a comfortable ritual. But today, everything is different. The silence isn't heavy anymore. It isn't a weight. It's peaceful, because I know I'm not alone in it. In a little while, I'll hear the familiar rumble of Frank's old pickup truck as he swings by to get me for our morning at the VFW. My old lazy boy recliner is still in the living room, right where it's always been. For a long time, that chair was my world. It was a dock, but one I never sailed from. It was my waiting room, a place to let the hours pass until the day was done. I look at it now through the screen door, and it's just a chair, a comfortable piece of furniture. It no longer has any power over me because my life is no longer lived within its 4-foot radius. My world has expanded beyond the living room, beyond this house, and has become richer than I ever thought possible again. I look down at my hands, wrapped around the reassuring warmth of the mug. They tell the whole story, really. The old, thick calluses of a carpenter are still there, layered like rings on a tree, a map of a life spent building things. This house, a home, a family. But there are new scars, too, faint white lines across the knuckles that weren't there a year ago, Each one is a chapter in a story I never asked to write. I see a faint, silvery line and remember the sharp edge of a filing cabinet drawer, a flare of anger and frustration. Another, a small, puckered mark, reminds me of a fall, of a moment when despair made my feet feel like they were cast in lead. These hands built a life, and then they fought a war to reclaim it. They say time heals all wounds. I've come to believe that's a well-meaning lie we tell ourselves. I don't think time heals a damn thing. It just dulls the edges, papers over the cracks until the next tremor hits. Time is just a river. It doesn't care if you're drowning in it. It's what you do with that time that matters. We are the ones who heal. We make the choice, day after day, to pick up the tools, to face the damaged wood, to sand down the rough, splintered edges, and to see if we can build something new from the wreckage. It's hard, painstaking work. And some days you feel like you're getting nowhere, but it's the only work that truly counts. All my life I lived by a simple, rigid code, one handed down from my father and his father before him. Be self-reliant. Stand on your own 2 feet. Don't ever be a burden. I wore that code like a suit of armor, and for decades it served me well. But I see now that armor can become a cage. I thought it made me strong, but I was wrong. Self-reliance doesn't have to mean being alone. Strength isn't about never falling down or never showing a crack in the facade. Any fool can stand tall when the ground is steady. Real strength is what you do after you've been knocked flat on your back. It's finding the courage to admit you can't get up by yourself. It's knowing how to let someone give you a hand to pull you up. And then, once you're steady on your feet again, it's turning around, searching the faces in the crowd, and offering your hand to the next person who needs it. I haven't gone to see Jack yet. I'm not ready for that, and I don't know when I'll be. Maybe never. The anger is gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. But last week I sat down and wrote him a letter. I didn't write about blame, and I certainly didn't promise any easy forgiveness. That's a long, winding road, and I don't know where it leads. I just told him about the woodshop. I told him that trying to repair a life is a lot like trying to repair a fine piece of wood. It takes immense patience. It takes precision. And most importantly, you have to accept that the cracks from the old breaks will always be there. You can't just fill them with putty and pretend they never existed. But if you're careful, if you're honest, and if you honor the grain of the wood, you can build something new around those cracks. Sometimes, with the right kind of joinery, the piece can even become stronger than it was before. It's a chance. That's all I could offer him. A chance to start the work. I lean my head back against the post and look up at the house. My oak house. It's a silent witness. It has seen everything. It has held the echoes of my love for Mary, the joyful noise of a young boy growing up, the hollow silence of grief. It has felt the chill of betrayal and the slow, quiet warmth of a life being reborn within its walls. For so long, it was my monument to one man's pride, a symbol of my rugged independence. It's not that anymore. It's become a testament to something bigger, something better. It's a witness to the profound strength you can find in other people. It's become a safe place, a harbor. A gentle breeze stirs the leaves, and the wind chimes. Mary, hung by the kitchen window years ago, began to play. It's a soft, clear sound, a series of simple, clean notes. The little copper links that hold them together, weathered green by the seasons, are glinting in the new morning sun. For the longest time, after she was gone, that sound was a haunting whisper from the past, a constant, painful reminder of everything I'd lost. But it's not anymore. That sound isn't the ghost of yesterday. It's the music of today, and it's the promise of tomorrow. There was a moment in my fight, a dark moment, when my own son tried to take my story away from me by telling the world I was just a confused old man. That loneliness taught me that our stories, our truths, are the most powerful things we have, and they are worth fighting for. You know, when we men, who've seen more than a few decades, get together, the stories just seem to flow like a river. Today, I've opened up my heart a bit, and now I'd be honored to hear yours. You know, Something as simple as a click of a button, a like, a subscribe, or a share might seem like a small, passing thing to many. But to me, and to all the quiet voices out there waiting to be heard, every single one of those clicks is a light in the darkness. It's a way of saying, I see you, I hear you, your story matters. Now that I've shared my story, what I want most is to listen to yours. In the comments below, I'd be truly honored if you would share a piece of your own story. Was there a time you felt dismissed or unheard? What passion did someone else once call foolish? Or what was a moment, maybe a quiet one, when you found your own strength? Please share. I will read them and I will carry them with me, because your stories are important. At WAWA Ages, we want to build a community where we men, fathers and grandfathers, can share our real experiences, the good and the bad. If you don't have a struggle to share today, then share a small victory. What made you smile today? If you're watching this on your television, don't hesitate to pick up your phone and search for my channel, WAWA Ages. Let's build this place together, a community where no man has to feel like his life, his struggles, and his triumphs are invisible. Thank you for sitting here with me. It means more than you know.